On behalf of the event's sponsors, the Walter Roberts Foundation, the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, the School of Media and Public Affairs, and the Elliott School, I'd like to welcome you all to the Walter Roberts Annual Lecture. I'd also like to welcome our live stream audience over there. So, hello, welcome. My name is Babak Bahadur. I'm the director of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. Today's lecture is a discussion between David Sanger and Frank Sesno, and is focused on David's new book, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. And that defense is going on in interesting ways, as we all can see. David Sanger is SMPA's 2024-25 Distinguished Terker Fellow, established by Bruce and Cindy Terker in 2010. Parents of the 2013 SMPA graduate student Jennifer Terker. The Terker Distinguished Fellows in the Media and Public Affairs program brings exceptional professionals from the field of media, political communication, and public affairs to SMPA each academic year. David Sanger has been at the New York Times for over 4 decades and is currently their White House and national security correspondent. He reports on the president and his administration with a particular focus on foreign policy and its intersection with technology, politics, and superpower conflict. The Walter Roberts Annual Lecture honors the legacy of Dr. Walter Roberts, who was a distinguished diplomat, broadcaster, and scholar. Walter Roberts started his career with the Voice of America and finished as Associate Director of the U.S. Information Agency. He was appointed by President George H.W. Bush and reappointed by President Bill Clinton as a member of the U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. As a scholar, he shared his knowledge on public diplomacy teaching at George Washington University for many years. Today's discussion is moderated by Frank Sesno, who has a long and distinguished career in journalism with over 2 decades at CNN, including as White House correspondent and Washington bureau chief. At GW, he was the former director of the School of Media and Public Affairs and is now a professor and director of strategic initiatives and executive director for GW's Alliance for a Sustainable Future. So with that, I will pass it on to Frank and David. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, thank you, Babak, and thank you, everybody who's in the room, and thanks to those who are live streaming and viewing this from afar. And David, thank you very much for being here.
Well, it's really great to be here. I've had a terrific time being a Terker Fellow. It's given me a chance to get into some classrooms, meet the students, do events with you and other great faculty who are here. So I'm really delighted to do it and honored to be doing this lecture.
Well, I'm looking forward to our conversation, which will range through your book and how we've gotten to where we are, what's changed, what we've seen in recent days, and how the world is a little different. So let's start with that. We can think about the Oval Office blow-up between President Trump and President Zelensky. We can think about Vice President J.D. Vance's comments making reference to France and the United Kingdom, but referencing random countries that were offering to send troops to safeguard Ukraine's territory. Sort of a pejorative comment that drew criticism.
About your NATO allies, yeah. Okay.
Exactly. From tariffs to territorial claims, Greenland, Canada, Panama Canal. The Trump administration, in very short order, has upended alliances, sort of redefined friend and foe, and brought its own role in the world into some very dramatic relief and question. Is this the New World disorder, David?
Well, I think it raises a couple of questions. The first is this the New World? In other words, if there was a system that was built after World War II, which was essentially a system about why it is that the world would operate by international law, by institutions, whether it was the UN or down the road here, the World Bank and the IMF, or whether it would be a world that would go back to great power politics. Well, Donald Trump is in the older version of great power politics. During his inaugural address, he named a former president he really admired, Was it Washington? No. Jefferson? No. Lincoln? No. It was William McKinley. So think about McKinley. What made McKinley really interesting? McKinley loved tariffs. Well, okay, got that one. And McKinley was president during the Spanish-American War, where the first time that the United States had a military sort of big enough, global enough to go take territory. And we ended up with the Philippines, which, by the way, McKinley quickly determined was a big pain to be operating and running.
Being an empire has limitations.
That's right. It's expensive. Puerto Rico came in during that time, Guam. So this was an era of territorial expansion and financing the country through tariffs. We didn't have an income tax for another 14, 15 years after McKinley's time. So that was interesting. This has always been Trump's instinct, which is that all of these institutions that we built after World War II have the effect of constraining American power, making us follow other people's rules. And so everything that he has done in the past 45 days, but who's counting, has been in the direction of reasserting that the U.S. is going to take territory, Greenland, Panama Canal, Canada, if you count it as a 51st state, and then Gaza. That was the one I didn't figure out. And then also that we are going to resolve our disputes through raw power. He wasn't saying we're going to do this by going to some World Trade Court.
Let me bring you back to a term you just used to make sure that we have it out there and we know what it is, which is raw big power politics. What is that?
Raw big power politics is, comes straight out of the Thucydides concept in the history of the Peloponnesian War, that the powerful do fundamentally whatever they want, and those who have less power adjust in whatever way they can. I'm sure I mangled the beauty of the Thucydides thought there, but that's the essence of it. And his view is that the United States is such a big part of the world economy, obviously still the world's greatest military power, even if there are other growing powers, that we're still in a point where we can go resolve our issues that way. And when you have that view, then you may be penalizing your allies as much as your adversaries. You may be penalizing your allies more than your adversaries.
So let me ask you about that, because in the book, and for those of you who haven't read it, I highly recommend it, you chronicle really several years of access that you have had, interviews you've done with Trump in the study. But in the book, you point out that during his first term, your words, he seemed to miss the titanic collision between great powers. And you write that he promised a great partnership with China and Russia. And you talk about an interview that you and Maggie Haberman did in 2016, when he told you and Maggie that NATO was obsolete, his word, I believe, and that we should look at terror and not Russia, because terror is the great threat. I mean, he seemed to dismiss Russia. So was that big power politics then, or does he just have some strange fondness for Russia, the remnant of what a president I covered, Ronald Reagan, called the evil empire?
I'm not sure that he has a fondness particularly for Russia, Russian history, Chinese history. He does have clearly an affection for, or at least is intrigued by, countries that are run by a single authoritarian leader who, in his mind, can get things done because they are unrestrained by courts, international opinion, international law. And while he wouldn't want to quite say that, he wants to go replicate their power, just listen to the way he talks about them. The day that the invasion of Ukraine happened, he went on some radio or TV show and said, when interviewed about it, well, Putin, I know Putin, this was really smart, okay? What he was saying was he's made a big, bold move to grab back some territory that is, central to Putin's conception of the Russia of Peter the Great. And as this book makes clear, Putin is not trying to recreate the old Soviet Union. He thinks the old Soviet leaders were idiots for giving too much power to the Soviet states. He's trying to go replicate the Russia of Peter the Great. And you go into Putin's office. The czars, right? You go into Putin's office. There are no pictures of Lenin and Stalin. There's a bust of Peter the Great. So he doesn't leave a whole lot of doubt who it is he would like to go be here. And so I don't think it's as much thinking about wanting our country to be more like Russia. I doubt he does. Or more like China. He likes the model of governance that enables them to get things done without being impeded.
So then that actually raises questions about the very title of your book, David, right? New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West.
Right.
Is America struggling to defend the West?
So, until 45 days ago, I would say we have had from World War II on, a national policy that ran across Democrats and Republicans to do exactly that, defend the West. Now, interesting question of what his concept of the West is versus what their concept was. When Truman created NATO in 75 years ago, a little more than 75 years ago, you remember the big anniversary was here last summer, the concept was that the NATO countries would come together to defend Western values. Over time, the definition of the West spread to include Australia, Japan, South Korea, obviously all strong democracies, very different kinds. And then NATO expanded, and then we've had European powers that may not be part of NATO explicitly, some have now come in, like Sweden and Finland, but who shared Western values. I actually think that for Trump himself, and maybe this is imposing too much of an intellectual order around his thinking about the world, I'm not sure he would put it this way, but certainly Marco Rubio did the other day. I think he's thinking more in spheres of influence.
I was just going to say, that's what you're talking about.
Right.
And it takes us back to a world where there were recognized spheres of influence.
And
certainly explains the Panama Canal, for example.
It explains Greenland. And by the way, in the realm of like not so crazy to crazy ideas on out here,
is that the standard you use when you write your stories?
That's how I'm doing this now, right? That's the standard I use when talking to editors about stories. I'm sure you remember this from your days, right? When you're talking about not so crazy to crazy, Greenland is in the department of not so crazy, okay? I mean, in 1867, Seward, having worked for Lincoln and stayed on through Andrew Johnson, tried to buy Greenland. It didn't work. Truman tried to buy Greenland after World War II for all the obvious reasons. It's a huge landmass. If you can control it from the naval viewpoint now for submarines and so forth, there's great utility to that. So the idea of lining us up with Greenland is not crazy. We had 3 bases there. We gave up 2 of them. We've got 1 left. It belongs to U.S. Space Command. That idea makes some sense. Next one ranked down, the Panama Canal. We did build it. You can understand why it is defended by the fact that U.S. warships go through it. Okay, we, in the Carter era, came up with a treaty, returned it to Panama. I can imagine why you could say, look, we're providing you with some services here. We at least want a break.
Well, it can also be a legitimate talking point that if your adversary, China, is making serious deals and inroads and
Right.
could suggest, even hint, that the freedom of the passage across the Panama Canal could be jeopardized, that's something to raise. Whether that's that's taking it back somehow.
That was
is another
mostly
matter.
fantasy. He said that the Chinese control the Panama Canal. They do
They
not.
don't control it, but they're.
But they do have at each end of the canal two big Hutchison-owned, Hong Kong-owned ports. Except yesterday,
Yes.
those look like they are being transferred in a very big deal to a U.S. hedge fund.
So that is really interesting, right? Because the chaos, the threats, the noise may be working at some level, right?
it certainly
You
does.
cited that example. Suddenly Zelensky's writing a letter and saying, well, I really do appreciate America, and you can have my mineral, we'll do a mineral deal, and maybe we'll come to peace. And now Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others are maybe starting to suggest they will pony up big money to help rebuild Gaza. And Europe is talking about its security.
Right, they are now, yeah, they were raising it beforehand.
So is it working?
So there is an element to this, and that certainly the folks around Trump would tell you, yeah, look at all of these. There's our list. This works.
Have you
that
wrote
all
that?
you
Have you
need is
written that story?
a little bit of power. I have written about this. The question is he winning some short-term tactical gains? You know, getting an American firm to own those ports, and that list goes on, at the cost of something much bigger, which is that we are in a world in which our alliances are our great expansionist power, right? The ability that we've got tight allies who will step in for us, who've got bases around the world and the capability to go handle it. A Europe that combined is, 450 million people, a combined world's second largest economy. That's all of enormous value. And you've got to begin to think, are the individual wins of getting the Panama Canal, back in the hands of American investors worth scrapping all of this? We have done more to alienate the Canadians with whom we run our North America defense system in the past 45 days, and it may take decades to go rebuild that.
Decades?
Decades.
Why decades?
Because the Canadians and the Europeans, I was just in Germany for a good number of weeks, all say, look, what have we learned from this? Trump was in, you guys all said, just sit it out for 4 years. You'll be fine. Biden comes and says, we're back. It's the old world.
Soul of America.
Yeah, you just, you had a bad dream, you woke up, okay, and here you are. And then all of a sudden, Trump is back, and they're looking at our politics, and they're saying, well, Trump may be out in 4 years, but J.D. Vance may be right behind him, who's, a version, by some counts, a harder version of Trumpism. If it's not Vance, it could be someone else. That, in other words, Trump is not the force here. He is the symptom of a larger movement. And if that's the case, we need to be ready to go deal with this. So 2 weekends ago, I was in Berlin during the election in Germany. And they hold their elections on a Sunday. And that Sunday night, all the party leaders got on TV and sort of a post-election debate, interesting kind of trend, right? And Friedrich Merz, who's going to end up as the next chancellor, the first words out of his mouth were, it is my mission to make Germany independent of the United States. What we have learned is that the U.S., Trump, but the U.S. generally, does not have a particular affection or interest in the European experiment.
I've covered presidents as you have, and we often refer to them as the leader of the free world. Is that term obsolete?
The members of the free world would, I think, dispute that if you had to say, is Donald Trump your leader at it. Now, there's no alternative right now.
And what you're saying is it's not a persona, it's an era.
It's an era. And that's what I think we're missing. And that's what really where, what I was trying to get at in describing the new Cold Wars. Because
so what we've been talking about here is mostly our alliances and how it upends alliances. But in the big real world, you need to know not just who your friends are, but who your enemies and adversaries are. You have a really interesting reference here to a speech that you uncovered, and others know it too, but you gave it prominence here, that Xi Jinping gave in 2013.
Yeah, we didn't discover it for years later,
right.
But yes.
And here's what you write. In the speech, Xi predicted that it was, quote, inevitable that the superiority of our socialist system will be increasingly apparent. Capitalism is bound to die out and socialism is bound to win. This is an inevitable trend in social and historical development. And you say, Xi warned his party's top leadership that they had to brace themselves for extended battle. The road is tortuous, he said. We must diligently prepare for a long period of cooperation and conflict between these two social systems, laying the foundation for a future where we will win the initiative and have the dominant position. In all this noise and all this flurry and all this big, do we still have in sight where the real threat is and who the enemies are? I mean, Donald Trump talks a lot about China, but we're deploying to the southern border, not to the Pacific.
So the question is, do we have our priorities set up in order of our threats? So first of all, this is going to be the big battle of this coming administration. Because when you look at the people who Trump has appointed, he has not appointed them for any particular consistency about their view about where the threats are.
There's no strategic.
There's not a unanimity among them. So there are some big fights coming. So Marco Rubio, traditional Republican. One of my colleagues published a great piece the other day that reminded everybody of Rubio interrogating Rex Tillerson. Remember Rex Tillerson? He was
Yes.
Secretary of State for 20 minutes, for about a year in the first Trump administration. Trump appointed him, declaring that he was, looked like he was right out of Central Casting, big, tall, white hair. And a year later was calling me on the phone on the day or day after he fired him and said, he was dumb as a rock.
He said that to you?
Yeah, on the record.
I think you wrote it.
I did. So the essence of where the Trump administration is right now is you've got a group of traditionalists who are thinking about Russia and China as adversaries who are coming together, which is a main theme of new Cold Wars, and who we have to orient our thinking about our defenses, whether or not we are ready to go deal with their combined power, if in fact they do put together a partnership without limits,
Partnership without limits.
Right, as Xi and Putin discussed in the run-up to the Olympics in Beijing. And I would put Mike Waltz, who the new national security advisor, in that category. Then you have a group of people who say, no, that's really, not where this is at all, that we have to focus on a different kind of vision of America first, one in which we are dominating our region, that there are spheres of influence, that we're back to that, and that means we command the North American continent. And America first means you draw high walls, but you don't get involved in these long foreign wars. And you see a lot of that in the way Trump talks. But Trump himself is not a classic isolationist. Isolationists do not talk about acquiring Greenland, right? They talk about, you stay out of my territory and you're going to be fine as long as you don't come and threaten me. And that fight in the Oval Office, what really set Trump off? It was when Zelensky looked at him and said, "You are now protected by these big oceans out here, but it won't be forever. And one day they're coming for you, basically. You know, the Russians are coming for you. That if you don't stop Russia in Ukraine, you know, Europe's next, and they're on to you after that." And that really set Trump off. And it was sort of this different vision of where the world is going.
It's fascinating. And we've seen this play before in our history.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Whether it's prior to World War I, prior to World War II. It's been said traditionally that America refers to the Atlantic and Pacific as its best, you know, its best friends are the Atlantic and Pacific. But it was also presumed out of the Cold War, the era of nuclear exchanges and all the rest, that these distances had shrunk and that there was a
And
different...
in a world of cyber and space, the differences mean nothing.
Nothing. Right? So how does your reporting and how does your knowledge and understanding of how Donald Trump thinks and the people around him cope with that reality?
So
that this is not, we're not in 1936.
Right. So this goes back to how does Donald Trump define America first in his mind? Okay. And here I have a confession to make, because you mentioned that interview in March 2016 that Maggie and I did. So it was a Friday afternoon. We're talking to Trump. We have to write the lead of the Sunday paper. And the interview is all over the place. He went into his first New York Times foreign policy deep interview with no notes, no aides.
Just the three of you sitting in a room?
Just the three of us. We were supposed to be together in Mar-a-Lago, but there was bad weather, and we ended up having to do it as a phone video interview. And he starts talking about pulling troops out of South Korea and Japan because they run surpluses with us. And I'm saying to him, okay, are you all right if South Korea and Japan then get their own nuclear weapons because you pull those troops? They're not going to believe we're here to protect them. It's all the issues we're facing with Europe now. Think about that for a little bit. Then says, yeah, I'm okay with that. It was a little bit of a shock to the Japanese when they read that in the headline. And we talk a lot about immigration, and I'm desperate for a theme. So I finally say to him, because he had never used the phrase America First, I say to him, you know, this reminds me of the old America First movement of the late 30s, thinking that he was going to say, no, I'm no isolationist, I'm no Lindbergh. Well, it turned out, as he said himself to me later on, he didn't know that Lindbergh had been part of the America First movement. He knew he flew airplanes, but the America First part he had missed. He caught up with it later on. And he said right away at that time, you know, I really like the sound of that because...
So you're the person who put...
What leader wouldn't want their country to be America, to be first, right? Makes perfect sense. So I think, Frank, I tell myself he would have come to this at some point, but I'm certainly guilty of speeding it along.
I think you just revealed to us that David Sanger is responsible.
This has been written about at some length. But the next Sunday, that was a Friday afternoon, he went down, I think he was doing a rally, I believe it was in Dallas, but I may have this wrong. And during the rally, he starts yelling America First. And I didn't know this. We had written our story. America First is a tiny little part at the end of the story. And on Monday morning, I go down the kitchen and I flip on the TV set and I'm making coffee and they're running little excerpts of this thing with the America First part. My wife comes down, I pour her a cup of coffee, and she looks at the TV set and takes a sip, and with that look that only a spouse can give you, says, I hope you're really proud of yourself.
You're supposed to report the news, not make it.
Yeah,
but that's,
right.
that's another
But ever
topic.
since, the question has really been, what does he mean by America First? And it has been a moving target, as you would expect with Donald Trump. But it's also a moving target because the people around him do not agree on that definition.
You know, all my experience in covering presidents and presidencies reveals tremendous amounts of work that goes into any policy change or pronouncement. There are the experts and the scholars and the historians, and there's the political calculation, and the diplomats weigh in.
The deputies meeting, the principals meeting.
Meetings, the deputies meetings, the Sherpas who go out to
It's
talk
a great
to the
thing. We've gotten, in the world of efficiency, we've gotten rid of a lot of that process.
So what is the process? What
great
is
question.
the process
So for
in the way Donald Trump and the Trump administration make policy and make decisions?
So when you go into this book, the first 150 pages of this book is basically how the United States got wrong where Russia and China were headed. We can come back to that later on. But the back half of it is how the Biden administration tried to deal with this and these rising powers, this confrontation. The S in New Cold Wars is about their coming together. And so you read about a lot of this process. There are not many of those meetings in this White House. Sometimes there are, but frequently what happened in the first term was that the president would tweet something out, and then the national security staff would be left with the problem of coming up with a process that would end up where the tweet was. Kind of perverts the system, right?
Well, there were all the stories from the first administration about how they tried to manage the damage or
Right.
Play down the policy.
But that's what's different now,
Right.
Frank, because, Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, Tillerson, for all the jokes we were telling about him before,
Master.
Was an establishment figure. Even Mike Pompeo, the next Secretary of State, who has since been banished, right, and believes that the United States has got to back Ukraine and stand up to Putin, and has been tweeting to that effect, but lost his Secret Service protection early in the Trump term. He was kind of an establishment character out here. And I think that Trump felt that all those people were managing him. And that's because all those people were managing him. Okay, right. And in the second term, you don't see those people there. Rubio would be sort of the closest to it, Rubio and Walz. But they have pretty much let Trump be Trump. And you've seen what's happened.
Yeah. I had the privilege of covering the White House when the Berlin Wall came down.
Mm-hmm.
Second only to being at that wall when it came down. It was just an astonishing place to be. And if you'd asked anybody a few years earlier whether that was possible, nobody would have thought that was possible. And it was era changing. It was its own change in era. What came after that was quite fascinating. The sense that the United States, democracy, capitalism was
the end of history.
Right. And you wrote about, and you referenced this a moment ago, so let's go to it because it's very important to understand where we are and where we're going. You wrote about what you call in the book the fantasy era of the early 21st century, that the post-Cold War era would last indefinitely. A, why did we have the arrogance to think that? And B, what was the inflection point that drives the point that that's not the case?
So the core of this was the thought that China and Russia, each for their very own different reasons, would join the West and join Western institutions because it was in their interest, mostly in their economic interest. And the evidence right after the Berlin Wall fell, through the early 90s, through that period in the Clinton era where the French referred to the U.S. as the unipower, right? The single power that was out there, was that China was a really small developing economy at the time. There were no Situation Room meetings about worrying about the Chinese military in the 1990s, right?
Right.
And the only question was, as American companies wanted to get into that market and get to 1.4 billion people, could you get China to sign up to the rules? And at the end of the Clinton administration, they brought them into the World Trade Organization. And the theory was that the more they played by capitalist rules, the more that democracy would flourish. And no one believed this more than George W. Bush, who, when I interviewed him, a half day we spent on the ranch in Texas, basically made the case that economic freedom was political freedom. One would create the other. And this fantasy was fueled by the business community to a large degree, which had every economic interest in looking for evidence that China was becoming more like us, playing by the games, and therefore we should be able to go in, do business, and so forth. For Russia, it was a different thing. Putin had come in, but the country was flat on its back. It desperately needed oil and gas sales to Europe. He did not diversify the economy. And, you know, there's a scene early in the book, it's chapter 1, where Bush and his wife Laura and Putin and his then wife are floating down the Neva River outside St. Petersburg on this yacht. And it's late in the evening. They had just gone to out to theater together. They went to a modern version of, I think, the Nutcracker. They had this dinner going on as they're floating past the Hermitage. It was a beautiful scene. I was in the pool, the boat right behind it.
We weren't eating. That's when we had a pool.
That's when we had a White House pool appointed by the White House Correspondents Association. I realize this is a archaic thought. And we were briefly brought onto the boat. In fact, I had a memory in the back of my mind that there was this lurking guy who was serving dinner in the back. And we went off to go find the photos. And I had a terrific research staff that included Mary Brooks, who'd worked with me on previous books, and Michelle Carilla, and your very own Stephen Stamets, who's sitting right there, student here at George Washington. And they dug up a photograph from that night. And sure enough, it's Yevgeny Prigozhin, who later then goes on to give up catering and work on fixing the 2016 election by running the Internet Research Agency, and then creates the Wagner Group and goes and saves Putin in the invasion of Ukraine, and then crosses Putin and steps on the wrong airplane, and that
didn't end so well for him.
No, that was really there was a moral in that story someplace. But the conversation on that boat that night seems astounding today. They were talking about Russia joining the European Union. They were talking about Russia joining NATO. And we recreated it all because, fortunately, Condi Rice, who was the national security advisor at the time, speaks Russian, was doing some of the interpreting. And when we sat down to go figure out how we're going to report out this chapter, I called her up. I said, Condi, do you still have any of your notes? Next thing you know, we were on a plane to Stanford and sitting down and like running through what happened on the boat. But that conversation captured the moment. The problem was we all believed it for too long. And when Putin,
because we wanted to.
Because we really wanted to. That's the way we wanted the world to be, because it was a way to avoid conflict. The U.S. is on top. The Western powers were around. Trade is flowing. Birds are singing.
The history has ended and democracy has prevailed.
That's right. Great. It's just the movie didn't end that way. And so Putin shows up in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference and gives this fiery speech saying there are parts of Russia, Mother Russia, that need to return. And people are looking around saying, this sounds like the Cold War. But again, they sort of, everybody played it out. 7 years later, he took Crimea. Like, well, you know, it's kind of Russian speaking. You know, there were no sanctions on. 7 years after that, we're into the Ukraine war.
I want to go to questions now. I'll come back to this a little bit later if we have time. I'm going to start with a question that we got over the transom, and then we'll come out to the audience. So Professor Bahadur will have the mic, but we'll start with a question that we got from Tom Shanker, your former colleague at the New York
Times. Covered the Pentagon, had to edit me for a long time,
yeah, well,
poor guy.
So he knows what he's talking about. He also happens to be the director of our Project for Media and National Security here, which brings together top people in policy and defense with journalists from all over the world, so we're very proud to have this project for media and national security that enables some really deep conversation. So he says a nice thing at the top, as a former editor would. He says, David, your book is a terrific 360-degree survey of the national security challenges facing the United States. But I want to ask you about your framing of the problem. The title is New Cold Wars, but assessing Putin and Ukraine, and Xi and his territorial grabs in the South China Sea, and the fighting in the Middle East. Aren't we already at war, a series of hot wars?
There are a series of hot wars from which we are keeping something of a distance right now. We're supplying the Ukrainians, or at least we were until Friday, but we have never put troops in that war, right? And Biden was very adamant that we not have Americans in the theater because he thought that's how you escalate to World War III. And you know, there's a scariest part of this book is the weekend in 2022 when we thought Putin was going to use nuclear weapons.
Nuclear weapons, yeah.
Right. In the Philippines, they're skirmishing not with the Chinese military, more with their Coast Guard over small islands that barely anybody lives on, but fishermen use and so forth. So there are little proxy wars bursting out, but I would not say that we are at war. The closest place that we are in low-level, short-of-war, constant conflict is cyberspace. And the place we worry about the most that we could trigger a war is in actual space. You know, last year, the Biden administration believed that the Russians were going to put a nuclear weapon in space so that they could basically blow up the satellite systems that are in circulation.
And the Chinese have had major cyber attacks in this country with concerns that they could shut the system down.
Of course, the point we tried to get the Chinese to make to the Russians was it's really hard to set that nuclear weapon off in space and take out just the American satellites. And there are a lot of Chinese satellites out there. So part of this has been the jockeying to sort of try to say, hey, they're your friends. Why don't you go tell your crazy friend not to put a nuclear weapon in space because it's going to take out 20 years of your investment.
So Tom has a follow, and then we'll turn to the audience. And it's a very thoughtful and interesting point and question. He writes, the U.S. essentially it's a binary place, on, off, war, peace. But Russia and China see conflict on a continuum. And in the actions of this emerging arc of authoritarianism, aren't our adversaries already on a war footing while we are not?
There you could certainly argue that their thinking is certainly to be more on a war footing. You see it in the way China has moved from planning around Taiwan to exercises around Taiwan to what I think you could call rehearsals around.
Getting closer, territorially closer.
Right. And the story in this book about how they exploited Nancy Pelosi's arrival in Taiwan to be able to go start up operations fully around the island that have never ceased long after Nancy Pelosi was gone, tells you that. Ukraine, you can view Ukraine one of two ways. You can view it as the war that is confined to Ukraine itself and now 20% of the country, or you can view it as Zelensky wants you to view it, and as he argued in the Oval Office, as the first step as Russia tries to grab Ukraine, and what happens when the next one is a small NATO country, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, something like that. And that's what's really changed in the past 45 days, Frank. Because if you were Latvia or Lithuania or whatever, and you heard Biden say repeatedly, whether you believed him or not, that not 1 inch of NATO territory will be left undefended, do you actually think, after what you've seen for the past 45 days, that if the Russians decided to go take Lithuania or Latvia or something, that Donald Trump would send American troops to and invoke Article 5?
Right.
Okay.
And let me just mention to the audience, and I know you've had these conversations too. I was in Poland a few years ago, shortly after we had deployed a few thousand troops, U.S. troops, to Poland as an expression of support.
This was after the Ukraine war.
After the Ukraine war, after the invasion. Poland is a bordering state, worrying desperately about what this means. And we heard repeated expressions of how much that meant symbolically to the Polish government to have just a few thousand U.S. troops there.
Because they're a tripwire. Yeah.
Exactly.
You can't
And
go
so
into Poland without killing Americans.
That's a lot of what has changed.
Two quick points about that. First, if you're Xi Jinping and you're watching this play out, and you're watching that conversation happen in the Oval Office, and you're thinking, okay, he's making it clear, the president, that he is thinking about cutting off all of the aid to Ukraine and coming up with a settlement where it's not really up to the Ukrainians to figure out what kind of guarantees there are. Now, fast forward, what lesson do I get from this for Taiwan? And there are some voices in Beijing, think tanks, so forth, who are beginning to say, hey guys, we're never going to have a better moment than in the next couple of years.
Go in militarily.
Right. And then there's a counter group that says, hey, our economy has finally hit the rocks. Let's not risk this right now. Why push this when we've got a lot of problems right here? And you could just keep this bubbling for a while and not risk the issue. So that's problem number one that comes out of this. Problem number two that comes out of this is if you are the rest of Europe and you think, well, the United States may not be there for Lithuania or maybe Poland, then do we need a separate European military force, which is basically NATO without the United States and a couple of other countries? And that discussion was very active when I left Berlin a week ago Thursday. And that then takes you to the next question. Excuse me, who inside Europe already has nuclear weapons? Two countries. Two random countries, okay? Britain and France. If you're the Germans, sooner or later, you got to think, do we need them too? The whole effort since World War II has been, let's make Germany feel plenty secure so they know that we're there with them, but let's not let them build an independent nuclear force because life is long and you never know how things are going to turn out. And we may be stepping on that.
Well, apparently Francis Fukuyama was wrong. History did not end a few years ago. So let's turn to the room here, and we'll start here. I'm going to ask you to stand and quickly introduce yourself and get your question out quickly so we can get as many in as possible.
Hello, Adam. Is that working?
Is it up?
Is it? No, it's not.
Is it off?
It's off. It's no battery.
Tap it, Buck. No. No. No.
It's good, it's on.
Is it off?
No,
No, it's not.
it's not.
He's saying this, so let me just speak to it.
Okay,
Oh.
fine. Hello, Adam DePico from Columbia University. Ian Bremner's my professor at the moment.
Oh, great.
And on this sort of the thesis of your book, who do you see as the winner out of all of this? On the similar line of the G0 world, which Ian Bremner posits, having this conversation with him last week, he sees the Middle Eastern states as the greatest sort of winners from all of this in terms of G0 world. In the terms of this new Cold War, who do you see the long-term winners being?
So the United States is better positioned, or was better positioned, I think, to be the winner of this than any of the other major powers. Our economy has been surging ahead. A few years ago, as Ian himself point he frequently makes, all of Europe together and the United States had roughly the same GDP. It's not even close anymore. The growth, the activity, the work on AI, the innovation has been here in the United States. The military growth, our military budget right now is about $900 billion. It's sometime in the Trump era, I suspect it will cross $1 trillion. Hard to believe that. Bigger than Russia and China combined by considerable numbers. So for all of the concern we had in the United States, the country is failing and all that, if you look comparatively, we were doing better than almost anybody. We have that at risk now, and we face a big challenge as we watch Russia, China, and to some degree, Iran and North Korea come together. But imagine this world for a sec, where the Europeans look at the United States and all they see is a series of tariff threats. You've then created a vacuum because Europe's main partner was economic partner was going to be the US. Tell me that they are not going to then turn around and do some kind of economic partnership with Mexico and Canada, which also seem to be a little unhappy, with China and Russia. And the Germans have been told by the United States for the past couple of years, don't be trading with China because that they're not your future politically as well as economically, and they've had to pay a significant price in their auto industry and so forth. So the big concern I have out of this is when we turn off these alliances, we create a vacuum that someone's going to fill. And the Chinese are, I think, the best suited to fill it. In the Middle East, the Saudis, the UAE, they will fill some, but I don't think they've got the capacity to do this across the board.
Another question here. There we
Hi,
go.
my name is Dave Motherall, and my question is, how credible do you consider the allegations that Donald Trump was recruited by the Soviets as a Soviet asset and then as a Russian asset afterward?
I have never seen any evidence to that point. In fact, during the Russia investigations, during his first term, we were even just looking at things like, are there enough real estate deals there to explain it? But it may simply be the admiration that we started off discussing, the model out here, that explains a good deal of this.
Another question, sir.
Hi, David. My name is Colin Cleary. I'm an adjunct here at GW. I just wanted to draw you out. You alluded to the nuclear issue before, and so where we are in the future and heading in that direction. I note that in the course of this war with Ukraine, Putin, Medvedev, the propagandists on TV have almost on a daily basis, maybe up until very recently, been threatening very openly nuclear weapons. China doesn't do that, So and you mentioned the proximity of a potential use of weapons in the fall of 2022. So there does seem to be a difference in the imminence of the threat, or China's using it apparently still as a deterrent, whereas Russia, as apparently aggressively, ready to use it, deploy them, threaten it constantly. So there does seem to be a real difference on the nuclear posture. And then I don't know where Trump fits into that. But.
Sure. So you have sort of three moving parts going on here. So moving part number one is the deadline of February of 2026. We have 11 months until the last treaty that restrains the size of Russia and the United States' arsenal, not for what they've been threatening to use, not the tactical weapons, but the ICBMs, right, expires. In his first term, Trump said, I don't want to sign any new treaties that don't have China in them as well, because at the time that we did New START, China wasn't a significant nuclear power. Be interesting to see if he stays on that line. Be interesting to see if this new opening to Russia that he's attempting results in a negotiation that replaces the New START treaty. It cannot, by its own terms, be renewed. That's problem one. Problem two is Putin, as you have rightly pointed out, their doctrine does not distinguish between nuclear and conventional war quite the way we do. They've got these concepts of escalate to de-escalate, which is to say, use a nuclear weapon, maybe a tactical one somewhere, to make the enemy realize you are willing to go use it, and then get them to de-escalate because they're fearful you'll move on to using your larger weapons. And that is not Chinese doctrine. They have not done it. But as the Chinese think about a confrontation with Taiwan, they've got a large number of tactical weapons as well, and they're watching how the world responds to everything that Putin does. So there's no such thing as separation here. And then the third problem is China's building up a significant force of its own. All you need to do is look at those satellite photographs of the silo fields that they are building. And for a while during the Biden administration, there was well, maybe they're putting a lot of silos in, but they're not going to fill every one because they're going to make us wonder which ones are got weapons in them and which. That debate's over. They're filling every one, okay? They are actually ahead of schedule from what the Pentagon believes will be 1,000 nuclear weapons by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035. And when was the last time you ever saw a Pentagon nuclear project that was running ahead of schedule? I just want to...
Or any Pentagon project, buddy.
So the Chinese view of this is one day we may get forced into a negotiation with the Russians and the United States. And we don't want to go into that without the same number of weapons that they've got and the same reach. And this completely stymied the Biden administration, which made no progress in their effort to draw the Chinese into a conversation on this, and you'll read a lot about that in the book. But we have not heard the Trump administration discuss it even once.
Another question over there, and then we'll come over here.
Hi, my name's Carter Johnson. I'm a freshman here at GW. I'm also a journalist that covers the Navy and Marine Corps. And my question to you is also about Taiwan and President Trump's relationship with the island and kind of how that's changing in 2024 and beyond, because there's a Marine Corps Major General that's participating in their exercises this summer around like the defense. And they're also discussing, a $100 billion investment in the United States from their chip manufacturers. So kind of how do you see Trump viewing Taiwan, kind of same as Ukraine and how he's treating them, or do you think it's a relationship that's going to grow in the next few years?
So, big interesting mystery here. We were talking earlier about differences of opinion within the administration. Yesterday was the confirmation hearing for Elbridge Colby for the number 3 position at the Pentagon. Bridge wrote a very compelling book called The Strategy of Denial that is basically about what you do to deny China the capabilities to be able to take Taiwan, go on to the United States, and so forth. He is part of a group within the administration that argues that's where our focus should be. We shouldn't be wasting our time and resources thinking about Ukraine. The big game out here is China, it's Taiwan. What we don't know is, does President Trump think that way? Trump's got an affinity for Japan that comes out of his relationship with the now deceased Prime Minister Abe. He's got a pretty good relationship with the South Koreans. He's got an excellent relationship with the Australians. But every time you've heard him talk publicly about Taiwan, he makes the interesting geographic observation that it's really close to China and really far away from us. Okay? He's not wrong on that point. The chip manufacturing makes a big difference. And there's a chapter in New Cold Wars that is basically about the silicon shield, which is the question, would China hold back from trying to take Taiwan because it needs Taiwan Semiconductor as much as we do? Now, we have concentrated 90 to 95% of the production of the most advanced chips, the chips we need for the military, the chips we need for AI, the chips that go into these huge processors that you need to process large language models, all in the Taiwan Semiconductor facilities. And if somebody had come to you with a business plan that said, I have a great idea, let's take the chips that are most vital to our future and produce all of them on an island 100 miles off of China's coast that the Chinese want back.
You might have
probably
said,
say,
not such a great investment.
there's got to be a better place. So the announcements you're seeing, like yesterday's, where Taiwan Semiconductor came and said they would spend $100 billion in the U.S., is part of this effort to bring more of this manufacturing to the U.S., be less dependent on Taiwan. Great idea, except if all of our best dreams come true, we'll be producing maybe 20% of these chips by 2030, which means we're reliant on Taiwan for the other 80%.
And for 100% or 99% till then.
Yeah, and so there are projects underway. Intel is building. I was just out yesterday in Ohio, right by a new Intel foundry that's supposed to go do this. But these take years to put together. To give you the idea of what this takes, the last major aircraft carrier that we built in the United States was the Gerald R. Ford. After all the cost overruns, it cost $16 billion. Every large semiconductor fabrication plant that can build these most advanced chips starts at about $20 billion. And you got to build them in 2 packs for all kinds of reasons I won't bore you with. So if you went to Congress, Frank, and you said, because of the competition with China, I need 10 new aircraft carriers, after some complaining and moaning, they'd pay for them. If you went and said, I need 10 new semiconductor fabrication plants, they'd say that's industrial policy.
Well, we did it with, just look at the CHIPS Act, how hard that was.
And look at that, and look at what the president said yesterday about the CHIPS Act. He wants it gone.
We are nearly out of time, and we have one more question.
Great.
And I'll ask you to do the question and the answer briefly so we can respect everyone's time.
Okay. Mr. Sanger, I'm David, too. David Hoffman with the Women's National Democratic Club up in DuPont Circle, 103 years old now. Men are members, too. The question, going back to Ukraine, if you look in your crystal ball with all of your judgment of history, et cetera, do you foresee, what do you think the chances are, I guess the odds are, that when finally this grinding war ends and peace comes to Ukraine, will it end with Ukraine having been forced to cede 20% of its territorial sovereignty to Putin and Russia?
So if you go into the end of the book, I address this question. I think everybody is in agreement, and I think if you woke Zelensky up in the middle of the night and got him, poured truth serum into him, I think he would probably concede as well that on the day that you have a ceasefire, Russia will be in control of wherever their troops are on that day. And right now, that's 20% of the country plus or minus, and there's some risk that that could expand considerably while this negotiation goes on. The hard part of this negotiation is not territory. The hard part of this negotiation is the security guarantee that you keep hearing Zelensky talk about. And why is that the hard part? Because he wants to be certain that if he does give up that 20% of the country, he will never admit he's giving it up. But if he says, we will work out these borders sometime in the future and, all that Russia does not use the time to rebuild, get resupplied by Iran, North Korea, by China technologically, and at some point a few years out, take the rest of the country the way he intended in February of 2022. And that's the Zelensky nightmare. And what you're hearing from President Trump is, I'm not giving any security guarantees. If you can get them from some random countries, the Europeans, great. But first, Putin's got to agree that those troops can be, in Ukraine as part of this deal. And then the second question comes, can the Europeans do this without us? And I hear very divided opinion on that question.
We are nearly out of time. There is a question, though, that I want to close with. It's something that I love to ask authors who spent, what did you spend, 3, 4 years?
3 years on this one.
3 years on this book. Traveling.
Would have been 5 without Stephen.
Thanks, Steve. But And obviously, you're very knowledgeable about this. You have a beat at the New York Times. You write on a daily basis too. But this went much, much deeper. The question I like to ask is, in all the work and research you did, what surprised you? What did you come across that you thought, I didn't know that, or I hadn't thought about it this way, or the light bulb went on? Is there an aha page, chapter, moment in here for you?
Yeah, there were a couple that came to mind, because this is a deeply reported book. We were traveling the world doing this. One came in the living room of the president of Finland as he sat there and described what it took to change the psychology of his country from we will always be a neutral state to we have to be inside NATO, right? And in just a matter of months, he had to alter the thinking of his countrymen to make this acceptable. And he managed to go do it.
And that surprised you when you heard it?
It surprised me to hear how he plotted out what he would need to do along the way. Now, he had a great ally in this, Vladimir Putin, who, scared the hell out of these folks, right? But, we had always thought of Finland, Sweden hanging outside. And so the idea that you could change this quickly is pretty remarkable. That was number one. Number two, it's in that chapter where the Biden administration thought there was a 50-50 chance that Russia would use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine and we would be off to the races in October of 2022. It was to the week the anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Were they prepared to retaliate if that had happened?
No. Their view was that there was nothing to be gained by threatening to use a nuclear weapon if Russia used it against a non-NATO country. But they were trying to plan for how do you use this to completely isolate the Russians. Really interesting question. If the same threat came today, how would Donald Trump think about that issue?
Well, on that question, we will leave this conversation hanging. I want to just thank all of you for being here and for the great questions and for joining in this. I especially want to thank David because you are one of the leading journalists in this country. This book demonstrates that and takes you very deep and in great detail with vivid descriptions of these conversations and these meetings. And of course, I want to thank Babak and IPDGC for helping us make this possible. So Babak, I'll hand it back over to you if you want to say some closing remarks.
I just wanted to say on behalf of the audience, both offline, online, and our sponsors, thank you very much for this fascinating conversation, Frank Sesno and David Sagner. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. It's great.
Thanks also to Jack, our studio manager, and Sarah, who's the organizer from
Here,
SMPA,
here.
for all the hard work putting this together.
And to our camera operators.
Yes.
Thank you, camera operators. Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, sir.